1942. The North Atlantic was a graveyard and a playground, depending on which side you were on. The gray waves rolled endlessly beneath the steel belly of U-boat 553 as it sliced through the freezing waters, hunting its next American convoy. Inside, laughter filled the narrow corridor. The smell of diesel, sweat, and cigarette smoke mixed with the scent of canned soup warming on the tiny stove. The young radio operator, Hans Becker, barely 19, scribbled into his diary that night. "The Americans are slow, clumsy, and loud. We can hear them before we even see them." His captain, Karl-Heinz Meyer, read the boy's words and smirked. "Keep that one," he said. "It'll make a good story when we return home." The crew chuckled. They felt untouchable. Heroes of the happy time when the sea belonged to them and the world trembled at the sound of their torpedoes. Above them, the Atlantic storm howled, waves crashing against the periscope tower, but below, it was calm. The men drank weak coffee, listening to the sonar pings of distant ships. "American freighters," Meyer said confidently, studying his map. "Slow, fat, easy targets. Ducks in a pond." His men cheered softly. Each sinking meant another medal, another letter home, another reason to believe that Germany would rule the seas forever. That night, the U-boats spotted the glow of distant ship lights. An entire convoy spread across the horizon, 20 ships at least. "Look at them," Meyer whispered, eyes glinting through the periscope. "They still haven't learned to sail without lights. It's like they want to die." The torpedo crew loaded the tubes, hearts racing with excitement. The order came, and seconds later, 2 silver fish slipped into the dark water. Minutes passed, then a flash, a thunderclap. Flames burst into the night sky as one of the freighters exploded. Cheers erupted inside the submarine. "Another one for the fatherland," a sailor shouted, pounding his friend on the back. They surfaced to watch the burning wreck sink beneath the waves. Some of the Americans clung to debris, their cries faint over the roaring sea. Hans hesitated for a moment, watching through the binoculars. "Should we?" he began. But Meyer's cold voice cut through the air. "We are soldiers, not lifeguards." The young sailor lowered the binoculars. No one spoke after that. The ocean swallowed the screams, and the U-boat dove again, disappearing into the blackness. Later, as the crew settled back into routine, Meyer opened a small tin of schnapps and passed it around. "To our next hunt," he said. The men drank, smiling, convinced that the ocean feared them. None of them noticed how the sound of distant engines had changed, how the Americans had stopped running and started listening. In the darkness beyond their steel walls, something new was waiting. Machines built not to flee, but to fight back. And soon, the laughter inside U-boat 553 would vanish beneath the weight of the ocean itself. The next morning, the sea was quiet again, a calm gray sheet stretching endlessly in every direction. Inside U-boat 553, the mood was light. The men hummed as they worked, cleaning equipment and checking torpedoes. Captain Meyer leaned over the navigation table, tracing a finger along the convoy route. "They'll send another group soon," he said confidently. "Same pattern. Americans never change." Hans grinned as he tapped on the radio set, catching bits of broken English chatter from the surface. "They sound confused," he said, laughing. "They're asking where the last ship went." The crew laughed with him, the sound echoing off the steel walls. To them, it was another day of triumph, another reminder that they owned the ocean. Meyer lit a cigarette and said, "Let them come. We'll give them a proper welcome." By midday, the sonar man called out, "Contact, bearing 240, multiple propellers." Meyer's smile widened. "The convoy returns." He ordered the periscope raised. Through the lens, faint outlines of merchant ships appeared. Slow, steady, guarded by a few destroyers at the edges. "Escorts," he muttered, almost amused, as if they could stop us. He gave the order to dive deeper. The hum of the engines dimmed, replaced by the low thrum of silence. The men whispered to each other, waiting for the perfect range. Minutes turned into an hour. Sweat gathered on Hans's forehead. "Distance closing," the sonar man said. Meyer nodded, adjusting the scope slightly. "Ready tubes 1 and 2. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man who had done this 100 times. The torpedoes launched with a hiss, cutting through the water toward the target. The crew held their breath. 10 seconds. 15. Then, nothing. No explosion. Only silence. "What's happening?" one of the sailors whispered. Meyer frowned, eyes narrowing. They must have turned. He checked again through the periscope. The ships had changed course sharply. The destroyers were spreading out like wolves. "Impossible," he muttered. "They shouldn't know we're here." But the sonar pings began, sharp, rhythmic, closer than before. The sound filled the submarine, bouncing off the metal walls. Hans looked uneasy. "Captain, they're searching for us." Meyer waved a hand. "They're guessing. Stay calm." The pings grew louder, faster. The crew exchanged nervous glances, then a dull thud above them. Another. The sea around them trembled. A third sound followed, a deep, rolling explosion that rattled every bolt in the boat. Lights flickered. A wrench clattered to the floor. Someone whispered a prayer. Meyer steadied himself against the wall. "They're dropping depth charges," he said quietly. No one spoke. The men stared at him, their earlier laughter gone. Another explosion thundered nearby, and the floor shook again. Dust fell from the pipes. For the first time, Hans saw fear in his captain's eyes. Outside, the Americans circled above, listening, hunting. Inside, the German crew waited in silence, realizing the ocean was no longer theirs. The next explosion came so close that every light in the control room went out. The men froze, gripping whatever they could to stay upright as the boat rocked violently. The sound of rushing water echoed somewhere in the rear compartment, and Meyer barked, "Seal the hatch! Find the leak!" His calm voice had turned sharp, his tone carrying the weight of fear he tried to hide. Hans stumbled toward his radio, trying to catch a signal through the static. "They're using sonar, Captain," he said, his voice trembling. "They can see us somehow." Meyer didn't answer. His eyes darted to the depth gauge. It was climbing. They were sinking deeper than planned. "Blow ballast tanks, level us at 180 meters, he ordered. The boat groaned as it adjusted, the sound like a wounded animal beneath the waves. The crew worked quickly, hands shaking, oil dripping from the valves. Somewhere above, another series of pings echoed, faster this time, closing in. "They're right above us," the sonar man whispered. No one dared to breathe. Then came the explosion, a booming roar that made the entire hull shiver like it might tear apart. A panel burst loose, spraying seawater across the room. The men scrambled to patch it, shoving rags into the gaps. "Hold it steady!" Meyer shouted, his face pale under the flickering emergency light. When the thunder stopped, the silence that followed felt worse. The boat creaked and moaned under the pressure. Someone whispered, "They'll never stop." Meyer turned sharply. "Quiet!" But the truth hung heavy in the air. They all knew it. The Americans had found them, and they weren't giving up. Hours passed. The U-boat crawled along the ocean floor trying to escape. Every sound, the hiss of air, the rattle of a tool, felt too loud. Hans kept his ear to the radio, hearing faint English voices. They weren't confused this time. They were coordinated, confident, hunting with precision. For the first time, Hans thought about home. He thought about his mother's kitchen, about warm bread and laughter. Now there was only darkness, sweat, and fear. "Captain," he said quietly, "what if they've learned how to hear us?" Meyer didn't respond. He just stared at the sonar chart, his hand trembling slightly. "Prepare for silent running," he finally said. "Engines off, no talking, no movement." The hum of the engines died, and an eerie stillness filled the submarine. The only sound was the slow drip of water somewhere in the back, steady as a heartbeat. Minutes dragged into hours. Then came another faint ping, this time above them. "They're sweeping again," the sonar man murmured. Meyer wiped his forehead. "We'll stay deep, they'll get tired." But the Americans didn't tire. The pings multiplied. 2, 3, 4 destroyers moving in a pattern. "They're triangulating," Hans realized. Voice cracking. "They're trapping us." Meyer gritted his teeth. "Prepare for evasion dive. Take her down to 200 meters. The crew hesitated. "Captain, that's too deep," one whispered. "The hull can't take it." Meyer snapped. "Do it!" The ballast hissed, and the U-boat sank lower. The walls groaned louder now, the metal bending under the crushing pressure of the sea. The men clutched at the rails, staring at the ceiling as if they could see the enemy above. Then another explosion, closer than before, slammed through the hull. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, someone screamed. Hans felt the floor tilt beneath him. He could smell diesel and burning rubber. "Power's gone," shouted the engineer. "Batteries are flooded." Panic rippled through the crew. Meyer's voice boomed out in the dark. "Stay calm. We've survived worse." But even he didn't sound like he believed it. A moment later, the sonar man whispered, "They've dropped a pattern. They know our depth." The next barrage came in waves. The first shook the floor, the second ripped a pipe loose. Spraying freezing water down on them, the third threw Hans against the wall. He gasped for breath, ears ringing, heart pounding. The noise was unbearable, metal screeching, explosions thundering, men shouting over the chaos. "We're taking water!" someone yelled. Meyer staggered toward the leaking section. "Patch it! Use the rubber seals!" The crew moved like ghosts in the darkness, soaked, terrified, working by the dim glow of a single emergency lamp. Then came a terrifying sound, a groan, deep and long, like the ocean itself was trying to crush them. The hull was buckling. "Captain," cried the engineer, "we can't stay down here." Meyer hesitated for the first time. His eyes darted between the pressure gauge and the trembling faces around him. Finally, he whispered, "Surface. Prepare to blow ballast." The order spread quickly, and the men moved, desperate now, spinning valves, pulling levers. The U-boat began to rise. Slowly, painfully, slowly. Every meter upward felt like a lifetime. Above them, the destroyers heard it too, the sonar pings bouncing stronger now, the submarine's rise giving it away. The Americans waited. When the U-boat broke the surface, it was chaos. The hatch flew open, and cold night air rushed in. Meyer climbed out first, scanning the horizon. Searchlights swung across the black waves, locking onto them. "Destroyers! 2, maybe 3, he shouted. A flare lit up the sky, bathing everything in white light. The sea boiled around them as shells exploded nearby. "Signal surrender," Meyer yelled. "We can't fight them." Hans scrambled up with a white rag, waving it frantically. The destroyers closed in, their guns trained directly on the tiny, crippled submarine. Through a loudspeaker, an American voice boomed, "Stand down and keep your hands visible." Hans dropped the rag, frozen in shock. The sea around them was alive with light and noise, but for the first time, he wasn't thinking about victory or medals. He was thinking about how quickly the laughter had died. As dawn broke, the surviving crew sat huddled on the deck, soaked and silent. American sailors boarded the U-boat, rifles ready, but their faces weren't cruel. One of them handed Hans a cigarette. "You fought well, kid," he said. Hans didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon, the sea calm again, pretending not to see the smoke still rising from the distance where their last victim had burned the night before. For the first time, the mighty hunters of the Atlantic sat as prisoners, humbled by the very ocean they once ruled. The morning sun rose over the Atlantic, painting the sea gold, but for the men of U-boat 553, the light felt like punishment. They sat in silence on the deck, surrounded by armed American sailors. The destroyer loomed beside them, its guns still aimed, though the fight was long over. The ocean that once felt like home now looked endless and cold, stretching toward a horizon that offered no escape. Captain Meyer stared straight ahead, his face pale and expressionless, his cap gone, his uniform stained with oil. The young ones, Hans among them, looked at their captors with quiet disbelief. For months they had mocked these same men, calling them amateurs, calling their ships floating coffins. Now it was their own boat that had become one. The Americans shouted orders, tying ropes, lowering lifeboats. Hans flinched when one of them tapped his shoulder. "Come on, kid," the sailor said in a calm voice. "You're safe now." Safe. The word felt strange. He followed the others down into the waiting boat. The sea rocked beneath them gently, as if mocking how fragile humans really were. When the lifeboat reached the destroyer, rough hands helped him aboard. He expected to be hit or cursed at, but instead, a medic checked his pulse and offered him water. "Drink," the man said. "You're lucky to be alive." Hans took the cup with shaking hands, too stunned to speak. The crew of the destroyer watched them closely but without hatred. Some were young, not much older than the Germans themselves. One American offered a pack of cigarettes to the prisoners, and a few hesitated before taking one. When the match struck and the smoke rose, the air between them felt less like war and more like exhaustion. Meyer glanced at the Americans, his pride fighting to survive, but even he couldn't hide the defeat in his eyes. "They're treating us like men," Hans whispered to himself, "not enemies." As the destroyer moved toward the nearest base, the Germans sat huddled together, staring at the waves. Every explosion, every cheer from their days of hunting convoys now echoed in their heads like ghosts. Hans thought about the freighters they had sunk, the sailors who never made it home, the flames, the screams. He wondered how many Americans had watched the sea swallow their friends just as he had watched the ocean swallow his. He realized that the war had not just been between ships, but between pride and reality. Later that night, an officer on the American ship approached Meyer. "Your U-boat's going under," he said quietly. "We had to scuttle it." Meyer didn't look up. "I know," he replied softly. "She was already dead." He turned his gaze toward the horizon, the same ocean that had made him a hero back home, now taking everything he had left. The next day, when they reached the port, the prisoners were escorted onto land. Crowds gathered to see them, thin, dirty, defeated men who had once been the terror of the seas. Some Americans watched with curiosity, others with pity. Hans could feel their eyes on him as he stepped onto the dock. A reporter called out, "Were you surprised when they found you?" Hans didn't answer, but Meyer did. "We underestimated them," he said simply. "We thought they were blind. Turns out, they learned faster than we expected." At the camp, life slowed into routine. The Germans worked, ate, and slept under guard. But instead of anger, most felt confusion. They had been told the Americans were soft, careless, weak. Yet here they were fed, treated fairly, even given books to read. Hans wrote in his diary again, the same one he had filled with jokes about fat American convoys. His handwriting was shaky now. They mocked nothing. They learned. While we celebrated our victories, they studied our mistakes. Now we hide while they command the ocean. One evening, an American lieutenant passed by and stopped to talk. "You know, he said with a tired smile. "I used to work on merchant ships before the war. We lost a lot of friends because of you." Hans lowered his eyes, unable to respond. The man continued, "But war's strange, isn't it? You do what you're told. We all did." He sighed and walked away, leaving Hans with a feeling he couldn't describe, something between guilt and respect. Months later, as the news spread through the camp that the tide of war had turned completely, that the Allies now ruled the seas and U-boats were being destroyed faster than they could be built, the prisoners fell silent. They heard rumors, hundreds of submarines sunk, thousands of sailors lost, the wolf packs gone. Meyer sat alone that night, staring through the fence at the stars. "The ocean has no loyalty," he murmured. "It doesn't care who wins." When the war finally ended, the surviving men of U-boat 553 were sent back to a Germany they barely recognized. Cities lay in ruins. Families were scattered. The ocean was far behind them now, but its sound lived in their dreams. Hans went home and became a fisherman, returning to the same water that had almost taken his life. Every time he dropped his nets, he thought of the pings, the explosions, the faces of the men beside him. Sometimes he would see American ships on the horizon, moving calmly across the waves, and he would feel a strange peace, because the sea no longer belonged to anyone. Years later, when he was an old man, a young journalist asked him what it felt like to be hunted under the water. Hans smiled faintly and said, "We laughed at them once. We called them fools. But the ocean doesn't forgive arrogance. It taught us humility the hard way." He looked out at the water, endless and calm, and whispered, "The depth charges didn't just destroy our boat. They destroyed our pride." And as the waves rolled gently against the pier, the old sailor stood quietly, listening to the faint hum of ships far away, knowing that the sea had given him his greatest lesson, that every empire, no matter how mighty, eventually sinks beneath its own overconfidence, leaving only echoes under the water where laughter once lived.